Okay.
Hello, everybody. I'm Gillian. So yes, we'll be discussing today a variety of sets of tools that you have access to as educators of adults. And we often forget those that tend to come along earlier because we may not consider them as important. But we're talking about how to engage your students' imaginations and emotions in learning, and these are all very important things to consider. So I'm going to briefly talk about the first kind of understanding we have when as infants. It's the physical, proto-linguistic way in which we make sense of the world around us. And it's based largely on what we can sense. The world only exists to the child in terms of what he or she can sense. And the importance of that is based largely on the emotional response that he or she has to that experience. Now, I am very pleased you brought your bodies with you today, because since you have your bodies with you today, you have a whole set of learning tools for making sense of the world around you. Now, how often do you begin your class with a recognition, glad they brought their bodies today? Often not. But we'd like you to consider that, in fact, even showing up, I used to think of that when I was teaching grade 10, even showing up, there's a set of tools available for learning. So very briefly, what are those tools? We are a sensory animal. It is really fun to play with babies, better than most video games, I think. So I've got a 9-month-old on my lap, and I go, pop, get a bit of a stunned look. I do it again, pop, and I get giggles. Bing, just fits of laughter. Now what's going on there? That activity engages a whole host of these tools. The ability to sense things, the emotional response that comes along with identifying the pattern, the musicality in the pattern, and the sense of the incongruous related to what didn't happen at the end. So, we are a sensory animal, and it's important to consider that our sensory engagement in the world is not insignificant. We mustn't forget, for example, the Taliban education minister, who was very distressed to say, there's no way we can say the sun is 93 million miles from the earth. There is not a tape measure that long to measure. We rely on our senses. In something we have an easier time believing those things we can sense to be true. What we're saying is don't ignore the powers of the senses. Of course, the sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, but there's also the sense of pleasure, enjoyment, and all those that come along with emotional response. Because we are an emotional animal. We are actually perfinkers. Have you heard the term perfinker? David Kresch's term, to indicate that we are not solely thinkers. We perceive and feel and think together. So are we shaping our lessons around aspects of engineering or features of literature or aspects of dental hygiene work in ways that consider that our students are in fact feeling, thinking, and perceiving individuals? So how do we engage that? Well, we look for the emotional core of whatever it is we're teaching. And the tools we're going to talk about today are ways of tapping into that emotional engagement. These are the ways we can, in fact, engage our students as perfinkers. Humor. All babies, everywhere, between 4 and 8 weeks, no matter the circumstances, will smile. It's a means of establishing a connection, a relationship. Being cared for is obviously very important for the human being. But we all are born with a sense of humor, the ability to identify the incongruous. There is a reason that peekaboo is generally enjoyed by most babies. It didn't work on my way down on the SkyTrain today. The 45-year-old man across from me on the bus, on the SkyTrain, didn't think it was so funny. But the babies works every time. So, I mean, we have a sense of incongruity, the unexpected. Are we looking for the incongruous, the humorous, within everything we're teaching? Sense of musicality. Have you read Stephen Mithen's book, The Singing Neanderthals? We are the singing Neanderthals. We have a musicality, the ability to sense pattern, musicality to our walk, to our gait. Babies everywhere will dance uninhibited to the sound of music. Unfortunately, we lose that freedom. But it's the ability to recognize pattern and attribute meaning to it that enables us to understand language, of course. So are we identifying the patterns within whatever it is we're teaching? And the last tool we'll just briefly speak to today that comes with the body is gesture. And it's very odd for somebody to speak with no gesture whatsoever. There's other people who are told in their PDP training that they use too much gesture and it's a distraction, but I don't think so. So we are a gesturing animal. We are a communicative animal. Cats are not. If I point at a door, the typical 9-month-old child will look at the door. Typically the cat will not. The cat will look at your finger. I say typically because my Chloe, she never looked at the door. I always wanted her to look at the door, but she always looked at my finger when I gestured. She's come a long way since then, I have to say. So these are all tools for understanding, cognitive tools. They're learning tools. They help us to learn. How? Because they evoke emotion and imagination. And it's when those things are tied up with knowledge that knowledge becomes meaningful and memorable. These and all of the tools we'll be talking to today are little factories of understanding that as educators of students of any age we should consider when we're shaping our teaching. Mythic understanding, Kieran, I believe you're going to talk to this one, is all about oral language.
So we've got a toolkit with our body, and then we pick up an oral language, and with an oral language you get a whole new toolkit. And these are the set of tools that I'll talk about, and you will be able to use all of these with your students. The first and simplest is the story, and then, well, we'll see. So if we start with the story, if I say to you, he shot Tom, nobody here has burst into tears, I can see. Nobody's cheering. But if I say he always wore a nice shirt and tie and loved his grandmother, and Tom picked his nose in public and used foul language in front of children, you begin to feel glad that he shot Tom, right? And clearly, Tom had it coming. But we could elaborate the story further and say that when we say he loved his grandmother, and I've got to be careful now, that he and the grandmother actually they were awful, and they were selling drugs to students outside Vancouver Community College. And Tom was actually an undercover cop trying to stop them from selling the drugs to the students. So now, when you hear he shot Tom, you feel sorry that he shot Tom, right? Because clearly he was the bad guy and Tom was the good guy. The only way human beings can be sure how to feel about events is to fit them into stories. And you know you have reached the end of a story when you know how to feel about its contents. Stories are unique in doing this for human beings. If you want to communicate the emotional meaning, the importance of anything you're teaching, you need to deploy a story. Now, the story needn't be once upon a time, but if you think the way the newspaper editor says to the journalist, can you go and find out the story about the bridge collapse or the story about the fire downtown? They're not saying to the journalist, go out and make up a fiction about this. They're saying, find out what are the facts and the events and the important features, and then put them into a form that makes it have the most emotional impact on our readers. Okay? So that's what we are suggesting is meant by the story. That is, what you will do is take the content that you regularly teach, ask yourself, what's the story on this? That is, what's its emotional importance? And then shape the teaching to bring out that importance in the way that the journalists might do for the story that they might have. And I think it's often too easy to let the logic of the things that we teach determine for us how we're going to present them, and forget just a little that for the students, they need to have an emotional connection with that content. And the story is the only way of doing that. Stories are unique for human beings. If you go home and switch on the television at any time, you will be told a story. Often it's the news, that is, it's been shaped to have an emotional impact on you, or it's physical stories of the CI Miami or whatever it might be. But TV, the newspapers, all the media are constantly purveying stories. They're shaping the content to have an emotional impact. And that's the business we're all in. If we want to have somebody understand what we want to say, to gather its emotional importance, we must highlight that. We bring it out and make it front and center in the ways in which we teach. I was going to give an example of my running out the room, or no, maybe you running out the room, bored out of your minds by this. You take a dash for the door, you trip up, sprain your ankle really badly, which is an appropriate punishment, and then you have to be taken off to hospital because it's really a terrible strain, and you can't put any weight on your leg, and you're lying in the hospital bed thinking, oh shit, if I hadn't gone to that stupid lecture, I wouldn't be in this pain now. Oh. So how you feel about this event is changed by, the subsequent events. But of course, after 3 days, you can hobble out on the crutches and you stop at a 7-Eleven, buy yourself a lottery ticket and win $20 million. Now you're glad or sorry you came to the lecture, because if you hadn't come to the lecture, you wouldn't have twisted your ankle, you wouldn't now have $20 million. Mind you, with the $20 million, you've always wanted that yacht to go out in English Bay, so you buy yourself a yacht. First time out, you drown. Sorry. Now you're glad or sorry you came to the lecture, because the Greeks had a nice saying. They said, call nobody happy until they're dead, because you never know what subsequent events are going to change how you feel about preceding events. And that's the story of our lives. But it's an indication of why the story is so crucial in all human communication, where we want to convey the importance of something, the emotional importance. So we all have to become teachers as storytellers, to coin a phrase. Now, when we look at young children in particular, and we think about stories, and you think about the kinds of stories that young children are engaged by, and you think about something like the Grimm fairy tales. A typical 5-year-old enjoys the Grimm fairy stories. We can notice a few things about them. The first is that they're built on binary oppositions between courage, cowardice, security, fear, ultimately good and bad. So that the stories that grasp attention most are built on these powerful, abstract, emotionally charged oppositions. They're abstract and affective, they're emotionally engaging. And the concrete content will be meaningful only to the degree that we can build it on the binary, abstract, emotionally charged oppositions. So if you want to get somebody engaged in a topic and understand and give them their minds an easy way to initially to grab hold of it, then we need to present it in these kinds of terms, because we know that they work. It's not just that they work for 5-year-olds, they work for 95-year-olds. They work throughout our lives, because this is one of the ways our minds are structured. We think in terms of oppositions. We know, of course, that we don't want to be restricted to the oppositions that we first use to grasp things, because often they're simplistic. Active males, passive females. This is not one, think of the Grimm fairy stories, that we want to persist in. But we, first of all, grasp the world in terms of the opposites, and then we mediate and become more and more sophisticated in the ways we mediate between them. Another tool that we have available with an oral language is that we can create images in our minds from words. So whatever the students are that you're teaching, you will want to find out what images are central to the concepts I'm teaching, the content, the material I want to get across. What image really grasps the importance of that? We tend to be quite good as teachers in taking the content and breaking it into the appropriate chunks for teaching. But we tend, certainly at Simon Fraser, most teacher training institutions that I'm aware of don't teach students to find the images that have emotional power, that are central to what one wants to teach. And everything we teach has some powerful images attached to it. The little example here is that I'm suggesting, as the teacher goes home from the college one day, let's imagine a sunny day in Vancouver, as we saw recently, and it's, the sun is going down a little and it's shining on the windscreen. It's been a hard day, and you're developing a headache getting home, but when you get back home, you've got a Japanese garden out in the back of the yard, and you can walk out, take a cup of tea, sit in the warmth of Vancouver, and put your feet up on the stone wall. There's a grey stone wall around it. There's a moss garden with stones in it, and then you can look at the goldfish that are in the pond. And we'll imagine it's summer, and that 3 new yellow water lilies have bloomed that day. So now, what I've done is suck air into my lungs and let it out gradually over the larynx and the pharynx and shape it with my tongue, and it's created images in your minds. That is, you can't fail, unless you're really bored out of your mind and thinking about something else, but you can't fail to form an image. All the images you have will be different, but you will have imagined something about the little moss garden. So one of the ways in which human beings communicate most powerfully is by conveying images that are central to whatever we want to communicate. Sorry, I've gone on a bit about that, but everything we teach has some powerful... Think, what is the core image in what I'm teaching. And that gives you a great tool for engaging the students and understanding it.